everyone, it's Samantha, and today I'm going to talk about my labor and delivery story. So I want to first start out by talking about my plans for delivery. I had hoped to go into labor naturally. I did have a doula, so I was hoping just to be able to labor at home as long as possible and be able to call her when I needed her help, when it started getting rough, and then, go to the hospital and deliver my baby. So that was my original plan, and nothing went according to plan. Not one single thing except the doula was actually there. But if you remember in some of my older videos, I talked about having to switch doulas kind of at the last minute. I had basically a couple of weeks before my due date. My original doula that I had hired had a family emergency and was not able to participate in my birth. So I got the backup doula, who I absolutely love, and I'm so glad that I had her, and I wouldn't change it for the world now, but at the time, it was a really traumatic thing because I built a relationship with this other doula and it was getting switched at the last minute. So even, my original birth plan of having a certain doula was totally changed. So pretty much everything about my birth did not go according to plan, which in the grand scheme of things, that's totally okay. The end result is I have a happy, healthy baby girl, and that's really all that matters. But it was a little disheartening to not get my ideal birth. In every birth, there's going to be some surprises, but I just didn't realize I was going to get hit with every single surprise that could possibly happen. But I rolled with it. I did the best I could. I coped with it as much as I could, and I'm feeling really good about how my birth went. I don't think there's anything I could have changed about it. I don't have any regrets for the part of the choices that I got to make regarding my birth. And so I want to just walk you through everything that happened. What was really neat is my doula kept notes the whole time during my labor and my birth. So I have a full 2-page timeline of all the details covering my birth, which was really great. I only remember certain bits and pieces. I didn't remember as many details as she had remembered. So it was really nice to have that timeline. So as of filming this, I'm officially a week postpartum. So I'm a very weepy, emotional person. And hopefully if my little girl naps long enough, I will film a 1-week postpartum video for you guys right after this. So it'll go up very soon too. So before we get into the actual birth, my baby girl was overdue. My due date was the 16th of February and she was born the 28th of February. So she was 12 days overdue and I was induced. I had to be induced at 42 weeks. That's just the way my hospital policy is. And it's just for the safety of the mom and the baby. And so we were definitely going to get induced at 42 weeks, which was a Sunday. We decided to get induced a couple of days early. And the reasoning behind that was I was so miserable the week leading up to my birth. Everything until about 40.5 weeks was fine. I was, uncomfortable. You've seen my pregnancy updates probably. I had a lot of regular pregnancy symptoms and all that, but I really wasn't super duper uncomfortable until about 40.5 weeks. And then it was just all heck broke loose. I did have contractions pretty regularly starting about 40 weeks. They were coming somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes apart depending on the time of day. So I was having contractions. They weren't strong. I didn't have to stop what I was doing, but they were always there in the background and they would keep me up at night quite a bit. So the last week leading up to my birth, I was having the regular contractions. They had been checking my cervix since 39 weeks and I wasn't dilated hardly at all. I was between 0.5 centimeter and 1 centimeter dilated, just consistently that whole between about 39 weeks on to when I delivered. I went into the hospital and I was still about 0.5 to 1 centimeter dilated when I got induced. So nothing was changing with that, but I was having regular contractions. I did have some periods of stronger contractions, thinking maybe that was going to be it, but it was definitely not anything. So a few days before I decided to be induced, I was not sleeping. I went through maybe 5 days or so of sleep that was terrible. It was every 20 to 30 minutes I was waking up. I had nausea one night, contractions kept me up a couple of nights, and 2 nights before I went in for my induction, I started having diarrhea, just all the time, non-stop. It was waking me up every 20 to 30 minutes at night, so I was getting 0 sleep. I was really worried about being dehydrated. I was feeling terrible, just having all this diarrhea. and I was thinking, you know, I was going to go into labor, but it never ended up happening. So I was just to the point where I was so miserable, I was sleep deprived. So we decided to move up my induction date by a couple of days. I was induced on Friday the 27th, and the plan was for my induction, we go in the night of the 27th. They put Cervadil next to my cervix, which is just a softening agent that softens your cervix, gets it ready for dilating, and in rare cases, that will push you into labor just alone with the Cervadil. Well, most people don't go into labor just from that. Most people need something else. So the plan was they would put the Cervadil in, we would wait 12 hours, so it's basically overnight, and then the next day we would start Pitocin. So that was the original plan. Well, we went in that Friday night, hooked me up to stuff and monitored everything, put the Cervadil in, and it's just like this little, it almost looked like a tampon, but it was like flatter, and they stuck it right against my cervix, and it had a little string hanging out. So that's what it was, and they strapped me to all sorts of monitors because, you know, you're messing with your body. They need access to things. They were checking her heart rate. They're checking my contraction rate, and all this time I was having contractions. They went like 3 minutes to 6 minutes apart and just kind of varied between that range. So I was having contractions, just the solid week of contractions. And again, they weren't anything painful. They were just kind of in the background, kind of annoying. So that night, my husband and I stayed in the hospital room. They did have me hooked up to an IV, but only like the IV part in my arm. They didn't have it connected to fluids or anything. I think they call it a hep lock. I think that's what it's called. So they can hook anything to it if they need to have IV access. They already had the IV there just in case. But at this point it wasn't being used. I was just connected to a heart rate monitor, and they were checking my vitals pretty consistently, maybe every hour or a couple of hours. They were checking my heart rate and my blood pressure and all that stuff. And this whole time my blood pressure was still running low to normal throughout the Cervadil experience. And we just hung out in the room. I was able to eat and drink up to a certain time at night. So we were just hanging out, having some snacks. We watched a movie and we just hung out. I tried to get some sleep, and they did offer me a sleeping pill, but I just didn't feel comfortable taking one. And I was able to sleep a little bit, and by 4 in the morning I was having hardcore contractions. They were really strong. It felt like really bad period cramps, and the monitor was picking them up every so often. I think they were like 3 to 5 minutes at this point. It was getting pretty painful by 4:30. So the Cervadil ended up kicking me into labor, which isn't too common, but I think it was because I was already contracting so much already. I think the Cervadil was just enough to soften my cervix, and they checked me, and my cervix was like 90% effaced, and I was fully 1 centimeter at that point. So I was getting into labor. According to my timeline, I text messaged my doula at 6:30, so I was going through the contractions from 4 till about 6:30, and by the time she showed up, my contractions were very severe. I was in the bed on all fours, breathing through the contractions, and Johnny and I were just not prepared for how intense and how quick they would come on. I was having the contractions every 2 to 4 minutes at this point, having to stop and breathe through them. They were really intense. And this was without the Pitocin. This was just with the Cervadil. Had really jump-started my labor. At 8 a.m. they checked me, and I was 2 centimeters dilated. By 9, my contractions were pretty much unbearable. Since I had only needed the Cervadil and they didn't have to hook me up to Pitocin, they didn't need my IV at this point, and they also could take me off the monitors and just do intermittent monitoring every 30 minutes where they just check her heart rate, make sure everything's going okay. It was easy to tell when I was having contractions at this point. We did go to the jacuzzi tub, and my doula was there coaching me, and she was playing some relaxation birthing stuff, and it was really helping. I only was in the jacuzzi tub about 30 minutes. I started getting too hot, so they put in some cold water, and at this point, like, I'm not talking to anybody. I'm just like totally in survival mode, and I'm like in my own head, and not really communicating very much at this point. It was getting to be, I had to focus on what I was doing. We're getting close to 10 o'clock, and I get out of the jacuzzi tub. I just started getting more uncomfortable in there. I'm having contractions every 2 minutes, and I'm having them back to back. So at 2 minutes, I'll have 2 or 3 contractions in a row, and then I'll have a 2-minute pause. So I'm barely having a break. So we walk around the halls, and I'm stopping all the time for these contractions, and it took us forever to walk the 2 laps. I was really done after 1 lap, but my doula encouraged me to keep walking because it's gonna help bring the baby down and help me dilate even more. It had been about 2 hours since they last checked my cervix, and I was 100% effaced and 4 centimeters dilated. And at this point, I was contemplating medication. The whole time I was having contractions, they were super intense. Of course, you know, contractions are intense, but I felt like my vagina was ripping apart. Like, that's how they felt the entire time since the beginning of my contractions that morning. Felt like my vagina was ripping apart. And it was so unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life. And I was contemplating meds. I was like, why am I doing this to myself? You know, why am I suffering so bad? And, you know, worst case scenario with the epidural is you stall, your labor stalls. And my labor was going so well at this point. I was nervous about having it stall, but I was just getting to the point where I could not focus. I was barely handling the pain. It was just, I was feeling like I was losing control. So it was time for meds, and even my doula agreed that meds would be an okay idea. So the midwife comes in and discusses the med options. I could have an IV drug or I can have an epidural, and she was explaining, you know, both of them. Originally, I said I wanted the IV medication, which is called Nubane, but a couple of contractions later, I was saying I wanted the epidural, and it was just too much for me to handle at that point, so they start the process for ordering it. It takes a while. So they get me prepped for the epidural, and my epidural was placed at 1:15 p.m. So a little bit less than 12 hours since I really started labor. I had my epidural, and they checked me, and I was 5 centimeters dilated by the time I got my epidural. So I made it halfway through labor without the epidural, and I'm really glad, looking back, that I did end up getting the epidural, because it just changed everything about the birthing experience. Before that, I was completely miserable. I wasn't able to enjoy any of the experience. After that, it just totally took the edge off, and now I am a big supporter of anybody who wants to get an epidural. And I never thought I would say that ever. I thought I would always be like, oh, epidurals are bad. It's just totally changed my whole perspective on epidurals. I'm all for that, and I'm pretty sure if I have another pregnancy, I'll get an epidural. So when you have an epidural, you have to be hooked to a catheter, you have to stay in the bed because you can't feel your legs, and you have to have the IV. They pump you with fluids, and since my blood pressure was so low, they had to give me extra fluids. They didn't want my blood pressure to drop too low, and that's a common thing when you get an epidural. You can get low blood pressure. So they're just really keeping an eye on my blood pressure. And at 2:30 they check me, which is an hour and 15 minutes since I was checked last time, and I was 5 centimeters dilated. So an hour and 15 minutes later, they checked me, and I only have a rim of a cervix left. So in an hour and 15 minutes, I went almost the other 5 centimeters. And thank goodness I had the epidural, because it made the process speed up super quickly. My cervix dilated the rest of the way within basically an hour. And there was just a rim left, so they were saying I was 9 3/4 of an inch dilated. There's just that little 1/4 of an inch left on my cervix. Every 20 minutes or so, they're changing my position so that we can bring the baby down. Since I'm in bed, they have to roll me over side to side. And they try to sit me up, and every time they try to sit me up, the baby's heart rate just decelerates. And I mean, they rush into the room, alarms go off, they put oxygen on me, and you know, they're like 2 seconds away from sending me to get a C-section each time this happens, because her heart rate drops so dangerously low. And then as soon as they lay me back down, it starts going up again. So they just stopped sitting me up after a couple of these incidences. And it was really scary, because you hear, you know, baby's heart rate goes boom, 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 really fast normally. And then we were just hearing these little boom, boom, boom. And it's like one of the scariest sounds I've ever heard. Whew. So they're just really keeping a close eye on her, because, you know, it's scary when their heart rate drops. That means the baby's in distress, you know? So they were really keeping a close eye on her. They were making sure I was laying down, and they were just flipping me from side to side. But it's like every position change, her heart rate decelerated just a little bit. My blood pressure is going so low that it's, you know, setting off another alarm. And so they give me more fluids to try to counteract that. So during this time, they're just waiting for the baby to get low enough that I can start pushing, and they're waiting for me to feel the urge to push. And basically how they describe the urge to push is I need to take a poop, and the feeling of needing to take a poop is so overwhelming I can't think of anything else, and all I want to do is take that poop. So I'm just waiting to feel that. They're rotating me every once in a while to make sure everything's okay. They're keeping track of the baby's heart rate. And by 5:40 p.m., I'm ready to push. So at this point, I'm feeling that urge to push. They're coaching me through the pushes. Every contraction I'm pushing. And for me, you know, I had the epidural, but I was still feeling the urge to push. So they got me in all sorts of positions. We got on all fours, I got into squats, nurses and stuff helping me into these positions since I can't really feel my legs. We tried squat bars and all sorts of acrobatics type of things. I ended up pushing for over 3 hours, and the baby was right there at the end. So after 3 hours of pushing, she still was not all the way down the birth canal. She was just not coming out all the way. So my midwife talks with the OB, and they decide that the best course of action is the vacuum suction, like basically like a suction cup on the baby's head, and they pull the baby out when you push. So it's really, I still have to push the baby out, but they're pulling at the same time and giving that extra force. And generally this procedure is really successful. If you push and they can pull, the baby comes out. So they did the vacuum, and you can only do that procedure 3 times. You get 3 attempts. So through 3 contractions and 3 pushing, they can pull, use the vacuum suction, and she did not move. She's right at the end of coming out, and she was not moving whatsoever. So there was a failed vacuum attempt, and at that point they knew something was wrong. She just wasn't coming out. We just knew something was wrong. Her heart rate kept decelerating, and we had to just get her out. You know, after 3 hours of pushing and a failed vacuum attempt, there's no way the baby's coming out. So I did end up having a C-section, and baby Olivia was born at 9:17 p.m. So my labor was super duper quick. I started labor at 4 a.m. and had my baby at 9:17 p.m. So 17 hours of labor, and my baby was here. And there she is, she's crying. So I gotta go get her, and I'll be back to finish my story. So my baby girl was born on 2/28 at 9:17 p.m. She weighed 9 pounds 1 ounce. And I just remember during the C-section, I was kind of going in and out of consciousness. I was just exhausted. And I just remember them saying, "Oh my gosh, she is a huge baby." That's the only thing I remember them saying. And my OB and my midwife were both there, and they were both completely shocked she was so big. Nobody ever expected her to be that big. They thought she was on the small side. They thought she was around 7 pounds. So it was a huge, huge surprise for everybody involved. And the midwife even kept saying, like, "Where did you hide the baby? There's no way that that baby was 9 pounds," just looking at my belly. So the only thing I can think of is she just curled up into a tiny little ball, and her head was always really low into my pelvic area. So that kind of masked how big she was, I think, because she was always just so low and hidden down there. Because she was so big, they monitored her glucose for the first 24 hours really closely. Her glucose was always perfect, and she's completely healthy. There were no issues whatsoever with her. We got to go home on Monday, so we stayed a couple of days. At the time, I didn't know why we ended up needing the C-section. We just knew she wasn't coming out on her own, and it turns out her head was tilted in my pelvis, and it got wedged in my pelvis. And this is called, I'm going to put it down here so you guys know the spelling of it. It's called asynclitic. It's just where their head is not going through the birthing canal correctly, and she ended up getting almost all the way through. She ended up needing to go about a quarter of a turn more through my pelvis to come out, and she just got wedged. From what I was reading about this asynclitic thing, it turns out that the labor can be really, really intense because the baby's just not in there right. She's pressing on all the wrong things, and the labor can be really, really intense in your pelvic region, which was what I was having. I kept saying, you know, it feels like my vagina is splitting in two. It's because she was in there wedging wrong in my pelvis. She was just pressing on things wrong. And so knowing that, I know there's nothing I could have done differently. She just descended so fast, got wedged in there, and there was nothing we could do about it at that point. I tried my best, I tried to push her out, but there was just no pushing her out. So all in all, I'm really at peace with everything that happened. I know we did the total right thing for her, and I'm so glad I got the epidural because my pain was just excruciating, and I think because her head was tilted weird, it made my pain worse than maybe it should have been had she gone naturally and had she not been in this weird position. So really glad I got the epidural and just was able to enjoy some of my birthing experience because I wasn't in so much pain. I was just in excruciating pain since the beginning of my labor, and I didn't get relief from it until I got the epidural. So really glad I got it. I'm a firm believer in epidurals now. Originally I was worried about getting the epidural just because you have to be in the bed, and I didn't like the idea of having to, be stuck in the bed. I wanted to be able to move around, but when the pain got so excruciating, I didn't care I was in the bed at all. That was the furthest thing from my mind. I was kind of worried about having the after effects of getting the epidural taken out. There's risks of bleeding, risks of leakage, and risks of headaches and stuff. And since I'm a migraine sufferer, I was really worried about it triggering some sort of headache or migraine in me. And I had no ill effects from the epidural whatsoever. Not a one. Even when they were putting it in, I was in so much excruciating pain. I barely felt the numbing agent that they use ahead of time. They say it feels like a bee sting. I don't even remember that. I was just in so much pain in my pelvis. It just made my experience to where I could enjoy some of it. We were joking around and laughing and able to have a good time throughout some of the process. So that was nice, but when I first realized something was wrong and I was gonna have to get the C-section, I bawled my eyes out. I was hysterically crying. That's the last thing. I'm getting a little emotional now because, I'm 1 week postpartum. I'm super emotional. But that's the last thing I wanted, of all the all natural stuff. That's the least natural you can get. So to recap, like everything that totally didn't go according to my birth plan. So my birth plan was to go all natural. I wanted to do immediate skin to skin. I wanted to wait till the cord stopped pulsating before they cut the cord. And then I wanted to immediately breastfeed, doing the skin to skin. And I wanted, natural, unmedicated. I wanted to go into labor and labor at home for most of it. And none of that happened. Not a one thing. So to recap what actually happened, I got induced. I was 12 days late and she probably would have gone to 14 days. I got induced with drugs. I got the epidural. I ended up with a C-section. During the C-section, they did not do skin to skin. I don't know if they waited for my cord to stop pulsing, but I don't think they did. I'm pretty sure they just cut it immediately because she was having such heart rate problems. So it took a little while for me to get my skin to skin time and for her to breastfeed. But thankfully, she is a great breastfeeder. She has a great latch. Even from her first attempt, she ended up latching within a couple of minutes. So she's been a great latcher ever since, and now she can just pop on and off as much as she wants. A week later, she's so good at it. It's pretty impressive how good her latch is. So all in all, I really can't complain much. My incision and my pain and bleeding now are not very bad at all. So this video is ridiculously long, but I just wanted to go into detail on everything that happened. I feel like my labor was relatively short, but a lot happened during that time, and I wanted to be as detailed as possible for you guys. So if I left anything out, or if you have questions about anything, go ahead and leave them down below. I will do some sort of Q&A coming up. I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. So in my next video, I'm going to try to do a 1 week postpartum and 1 week baby update, and I'm sorry I didn't show her in this video. She got fussy and then she fell right back asleep after she nursed, so I'm not going to wake her up or try to get her in this video, but you can definitely check out some of my last couple of videos. I did introduce her in a video so you can see her real quick, and I'll try to have her in my next video. And also don't forget to check me out on Instagram. It's just super easy for me to update over there versus trying to make a video like this. So be watching for a postpartum update coming up soon, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. That is it for today, and I'm happy to say she's finally here after waiting so long. And thank you so much for all the support and love you guys have shown us. It has been so great to be able to share this journey with you guys. Have a great day. Bye.